One of the biggest picture problems that exists is how to get money spent on the right things. Most of our wealth and economic prosperity is sourced from nature. The best value proposition for a nature-based solution is something that saves you money but actually gives you a better outcome. Finland's a really interesting country in the sense that it has nature quite close by. If you're a water engineer, it's just applying the water cycle principles to the rest of the economy. We are now professionals. We're now the experts, right? We know how things should be. Well, do we actually? If you're not talking about nature at the top of your sustainability strategy, you've kind of missed the bus.
That is Jarrod Luxton, Senior Lead at the Finnish Innovation Fund, board member of Finland's Sustainable Investment Forum, and founder of First Arrow. Jarrod ventured from the nuts and bolts of civil engineering in Melbourne, Australia, across to Europe and Finland, where his interest in solving sustainability issues centered around better valuation of nature became his main focus over the course of his career. He is striving to find methods and tools for nature positivity, provide capacity building, and support the implementation of leading international frameworks and thinking in his Nordic home. My name is Peter Marcus Bach, and this is the Grand Challenges Podcast, a show about inspiring individuals who are stepping up to tackle the global challenges that our world is facing in their own unique ways. We reflect on the many out-of-the-box ways our guests have navigated the complexity and intricacies of the environment at the cutting edges of science, engineering, technology, and design. On today's show, Jarrod and I dive deep into the economics of nature-based solutions, from different incentives and disincentives to discussing what a best practice sustainability strategy looks like in 2025. We also compare and contrast urban nature-based solutions between Australian and Nordic landscapes and reflect on our journey and broadening mindsets, having both left Melbourne for Europe. Detailed information is provided in the show notes over at peterandbach.com/podcast. Thank you for joining us today, and please enjoy the show. I hope it's nice and sunny this morning up in Finland. Jarrod, welcome to the show.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Hey, we do have some sun in Finland. Actually, spring has sprung and we have positive temperatures and sunshine. So I'm very glad to see that. You also look like you have some sun in Switzerland.
Yes, spring in Switzerland is in full swing. Well, maybe not quite full swing, because if it were full swing, I'd be suffering from allergies right now. So thankfully, I've been spared for the moment.
That's good.
But nevertheless, I think you've got your nice anchorman voice going for this morning's show.
Yeah, I've got my water with me. Let's see how we go.
Yeah, no, it's great to have you on. It's been, I think we met 6 years ago. Well, no, even longer.
Longer
I'm just trying to work out the math. It's like when I left for Switzerland.
Yeah. It's been a while. I've been in Finland for 6 years. We obviously know each other from back in Monash days.
Yeah.
So yeah, we've known each other for a while, and I think reconnecting via podcast is super exciting.
I think it's always a really nice medium to then go deep into what you've been up to and also what I've been up to. Yeah. And I guess to compare notes, because, we've both ventured out of Australia. We both were educated in Australia at the same uni at Monash. Me first, then you. Mm-hmm. And yeah, now we've sort of expanded our horizons. But how's Finland been for you? I've never been there.
Yeah, well, I can say it's a wonderful country for people that haven't been, but I would recommend to visit in some of the warmer months for those that are a little bit scared off by colder temperatures. We're about to go into the Nordic summer, which I think is one of the most brilliant seasons around the world, really. I've done a bit of traveling, and I think summer in the Nordic countries is really special.
Yeah.
It's what happens when you have people that are stuck inside and cold for half the year. You can imagine the sort of emotional release that comes when you finally get some warmer and sunny weather. People sort of store their energy up and hibernate over the winter in some regards, and then that sort of explodes in the summer. So it's a great place to be.
No, that's great. I mean, I've experienced the Swedish summer.
Yeah,
I remember
it's
going
much the same.
jogging.
Yeah.
But either way, I have to go up to Finland at some point.
Yeah.
And also the daylight. That's another one.
Yeah. Well, the first time that you visit in the summer, I always advise folks bring a sleeping mask, because it can be a shock to the system if you're used to sleeping when it's dark. Unfortunately, if you come around midsummer or the equinox, then it'll get dark only at really late in the evening, late in the morning, even depending on when it is. And then the sun's already up by 3, 4 in the morning. So you only have a few hours of darkness. So you have to learn to live with that.
Yeah. Definitely something that's a culture shock and a shock to the system. But
yeah.
Either way, you've been there for quite a few years. One, iconic thing about Australia, especially Melbourne, is the footy.
Yes.
Do you miss that at all?
Of course I do. I think I'd be banned from going back to Melbourne if I said that I didn't. No, but I've caught a little bit of the football. There's an Aussie bar here in Helsinki called the Woolshed, actually, that runs sort of rugby, footy, all the different stuff. And my Western Bulldogs were in the semi-finals last year. So I managed to catch that before they were unceremoniously knocked out. So that was that was maybe the last time that I've watched footy. But it is possible to get here, and there's a small Aussie community here in Finland that sort of gets around the footy.
Aussie. I guess for those who are not familiar with the game, give me your quick, half a minute summary of what it is and how is it different to the other forms of football.
Yes. Okay. Australian rules football. It's not rugby, but you can still tackle each other. You spread out over the whole field, just like soccer, but you can touch the ball with your hands, and you can try to kick the ball through 2 very tall goalposts. It's high scoring, it's exciting, and the crowd sizes are usually quite large. So that's my best description. How did I go?
I think it was pretty good. I guess egg-shaped ball.
Egg-shaped ball, very important, yes.
Yep. And pretty high-octane, high-intense game.
Exactly.
I've been to a few during my time in Melbourne.
I think a full Melbourne cricket ground, which is the biggest stadium, the MCG, I think a full stadium there, anyone visiting Melbourne, highly recommended. I think you have to go and check out a game.
Yeah, definitely. And we'll put in a few more links to the game so that people can read up on it in the show notes. But that's not why we're here today. But I guess to wrap up Finland, the other aspect that people can also learn about if they want to know more about Finland is a podcast that you did. So you are a veteran to podcasting. Could you tell me a bit about that? It's a lifestyle show as far as I know.
It is indeed, yeah. So actually it was done by me and my friend Philippe. Both of us hadn't lived in Finland before. Philippe is half Finnish, but he hadn't lived here. And yeah, we did a show called Foreigners in Finland, which was really just trying to explore the foreigner experience in Finnish society and some of the funny things which we've experienced. And hey, it was a really positive experience. Really, I mean, we were learning about podcasting and just learning on the go. And I think you can see our quality sharply improve from the from the first few episodes. And it was never much more than a fun project, but that it really was. And we discussed some of the funny culture shock moments that you get in Finland. The first time you go to the sauna, the first time you realize people don't sit next to other people on the bus. Some of these weird sort of things which you don't know until you come here. So it was great fun to have discussions.
And that's something I'll have to check out in more detail. I've heard 1 or 2 episodes so far, but I think in preparation for a visit to Finland, I'll definitely have to go through the whole series.
Yeah, I would recommend it for sure.
But I guess you're settled now there and deeply into the field of sustainability and ESG. So I'm trying to remember. Economic, social, and governance. No, sorry. Environmental, social, and governance investing.
Environmental, social, and governance. Yeah, so definitely. I'm interested in all kinds of sustainability questions. And one of the things I've been working on most recently is really this intersection point of how the money flows.
Yeah.
Which I think if you're a big picture person like I am, even though I've sort of started in engineering, but I'm sort of drawn towards these big picture problems. And I think one of the biggest picture problems that exists is how to get money spent on the right things. And that sort of naturally draws you towards the world of ESG and these things.
And that was something that confused me because for whatever reason, I always thought you had a double degree in both engineering and economics. But no, you were pure engineering, civil engineering, the same degree I did. And I've always shied away from the economic side. I don't know why. It felt like taboo for me, or at least I just couldn't get my head around it. But you went straight into that. I mean, what's it like coming out of a very technical degree and then, realizing you want to see the big picture? But I guess that move didn't happen overnight.
No, it didn't. My background for folks that are listening, I studied engineering, as Peter said. And then, I went to work for an engineering consultancy working on engineering problems. But I was always drawn towards these sort of the why question, not so much the how question, which I think many engineers get sort of naturally attracted to the how question. But for me, it was kind of the why. And that one is what has now drawn me much closer towards this sort of systems thinking and drawn towards the, let's say, the financial space and not just financial space, but sort of, just the business logic of companies that are trying to grapple with environmental issues, I think, is sort of all tied up into this word ESG. It's a very complicated acronym, I think, when you start to unpack it.
It sounds simple from the outset, environmental, social, governance, just like the triple bottom line that we think about when we try to look at sustainability. So the economic, social, and the environmental aspects. Why do I keep forgetting environmental today?
It's because it's the one you always think about, so it's just already just imprinted in there.
Yeah, so much that you forget what the word is called. Now, either way, systems thinking, as you said, that seems to have been a recurring theme in the recent episodes on the show as well. But I feel it's becoming even more important as we head into the future in a world where especially AI is now becoming more mainstream. And I think the human quality still lies in this ability to then think in systems and to see the interconnections.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the AI revolution is going to be really interesting, I think, when it hits engineering. I mean, that's a topic for a whole nother day.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't think I'm the right person to maybe address that, but it's definitely interesting. But I think you're right in terms of being able to be creative and think about out-of-the-box solutions to non-straightforward questions. I guess that's some definition of systems thinking. And I think that's where the human edge is. And that's why I'm interested in that part too, because I think that's also where you can have a big impact, especially if you're sort of someone who really cares about sustainability like I do. And I'm interested in maximizing the impact that I can have. And I think you can do that by broadening your perspectives a little bit on what you work with, hence my foray then into the world of economics and sort of how businesses work.
No, definitely. And in the context of our favorite topic on the show as well, which is nature-based solutions.
Yeah.
And I guess that is really at the forefront because of, serious biodiversity loss, nature loss, also partly exacerbated by climate change, but also human activities. And that's where we really need to think about what's actually causing that. And I think when we look to the economic side, we can also see that part of the reason is that we kind of don't value or put a value on nature
Exactly.
at all. So
That's it. It's always been external in sort of economic models. It's an externality for those folks that have studied economics. For others, it just means it's not considered in the model, which is kind of funny when you think about that most of our wealth and economic prosperity is sourced from nature. A very large proportion of it, if you sort of trace it right back to sort of the raw materials and sort of where we grow our food and get our building materials. So it's, absolutely. It's a failure of economics to sort of not consider that, but it's too far entrenched now to sort of have an easy fix. So this is the problem. Nature-based solutions are, fascinating example of a way to solve multiple problems. And I think that's what we need now when we have these compounding crises of climate change, biodiversity loss, social pressures, all these things that are coming together that we realize we can't solve with a single piece of concrete. And that's why we're forced to look beyond and start to understand where we can both save money but also improve outcomes. And that's, I think, the absolute core of nature-based solutions. Like the best value proposition for a nature-based solution is something that saves you money but actually gives you a better outcome as an urban planner or an urban designer.
Very inherent to the definition of it is that multifunctionality, as you mentioned. And that's really, if you can measure that and you can target the different functions and have one system do many things, or I guess I don't like to say it like this, but to have one system tick many boxes, because it shouldn't just be a box ticking exercise. But if you can achieve that, then I think, your value add or your value proposition is much better. But taking a step back there. So nature-based solutions, that's the term we're using. I just have to ask you because you went through Monash and we use the term water-sensitive urban design a lot there. And then when I look at your career trajectory, you then moved from there into E2 Design Lab, which is a very well-known studio or consulting agency based in Australia that works on water-sensitive urban design. They have a long history. Actually, I need to get a guest from them on the show because they have some beautiful insights into how you design water-sensitive urban design assets really well. Then when you moved overseas, you joined Ramboll, which is another big name in this space. But I don't think they quite use that word either. And now you're at Sitra in Finland, which seems to use this term. What's your preferred term? Or have you organically moved to the terms as your career sort of shifted from country to country?
Yeah, I think it's context specific, but I think you have to speak the language of the people that you're communicating with. The difference between water-sensitive urban design and nature-based solutions, I think, is Australia's inherent focus on water, which is, of course, natural considering our climate. And, of course, if you go deep into the weeds, you could find some more distinctions there. But I don't like to draw boundaries where they're unnecessary.
Yeah.
Of course, water-sensitive urban design is a component of nature-based solutions, and there's other nature-based solutions that maybe don't have water at their core. It's interesting in Europe, water is not always the driver. And I think that's why this sort of WUSD kind of naming hasn't really caught on elsewhere. But I don't think it matters. I think people that work in the space know what they're talking about. There is a little bit of a branding issue with nature-based solutions, which comes from not having a single nature-based solutions agency. This is sort of like an organic term that's sort of evolved over the years. And I think it's evolved to include so much that it started to lose a little bit of relevance because people don't know exactly what you're talking about when you sort of refer to NBS. But that said, I think it's the best catch-all phrase we have for that type of design thinking, which is using nature to sort of achieve whatever outcome that you're trying to do.
Yeah. Although coming from an engineering perspective, many engineers I've spoken to may tend to disagree, at least as a debate. They like to have the word infrastructure in the term. But I think you can't have them all. I mean, nature-based infrastructure, blue-green solutions is also a mouthful. So
yeah. I think NBS is an easy acronym. It means that you're using nature as a tool. And whether you're using nature as a tool to build infrastructure or to improve farming or to improve forestry, it's all part of the same bucket.
Yeah.
And then I think you kind of specify from there.
Definitely. But I think it also, given its definition and its origin coming from the conservation side, it really embodies, this urgency that nature loss is a real thing and we need to address it. And working with nature, this idea of nature does it quite well, biomimicry being another related term, which is used much broadly in other fields. But that we can use that as I think you mentioned it, regenerative approach as well, to be able to then restore, and as we also teach it here, the natural water cycles, the natural flows of materials in our urban environments especially. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like I said, I think a lot of my career as I've developed, and I can say like it was a brilliant, I think 4.5 years that I spent at E2 Design Lab. What a place to start a career for me. Really, really awesome coming out of uni and going there. There was obviously a lot of implicit thinking there, which is sort of, it kind of goes unnamed in some way, which is this understanding of like regeneration, using nature, and it kind of all falls within this bucket of good practice in like water sensitive urban design. And I think what the rest of the world with their sort of focus on nature-based solutions, I mean, at least here in Europe, that's what people use. I think it's more just trying to put a label on the sort of broader practice. So it's not maybe trying to specify infrastructure types. I think that's kind of missing the point a bit, but it's more sort of the approach. And I think it's this conceptual approach of using nature rather than concrete that is sort of at the core of NBS. Yeah. And so we understand sort of some of the technical principles of it, but I guess that holistic understanding is still not really embedded because we suffer from the dangers that people refuse to implement them because they think they're expensive or they just don't know how to value them in the first place. That's been at the forefront of your mind, especially in your current role at Sitra. Maybe tell me a bit about what Sitra does and what their vision is for the future.
Yeah, so Sitra is the Finnish Innovation Fund. Interesting organization. So effectively it exists as a kind of a pool of money to fund projects that are interested in furthering the future of Finnish society. And that covers broad-ranging topics. We're talking about sustainability, data and AI, democracy, some of the biggest challenges that society has now. I'm obviously working in the sustainability department. And for an example of some of the work that we do, we're trying to grapple, for instance, with the tensions that exist between nature and the economy and sustainability and growth. And these sort of big picture topics, what that boils down to oftentimes are projects where we collaborate with people, trying to pilot different types of solutions, trying to figure out new ways to potentially structure something which kind of fixes these systemic issues. So it's an amazing place. I would describe it as a think tank, but it's also been described kind of as a think-do tank because we are interested in, of course, and we do a lot of actual project and pilot work. So yeah, really interesting. And I guess my role here in this organization has been really pushing forward our work with private sector companies. So there's, of course, the whole argument for nature-based thinking in public sector, and it's its own huge topic. But there's also then the how to get private sector, both capital, but also real economy companies that make stuff, how to get them involved and how to get them to understand the concept and sort of where nature-based solutions, circular economy, these kind of key topics fit together. So that's maybe a description of what I've been working on over the past couple of years here.
And that's a very urgent and important aspect because I feel like from the experience that I've seen in Melbourne, the private sector or the private properties have usually been, I guess, ignored or basically treated as not doing their part because maybe they don't have the capacity, even if they have the will and the investment to do it, or there's just worries that there's no consistency across the different sectors. And I think you see a lot of good examples on private land and by private organizations, but I guess the consistency is just not there to build the confidence in the holistic picture. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, my side, I've been really looking at companies and making sure that they have the tools and understanding that are needed to actually progress forward. And I think that there can be massive alignment issues when people within the companies that are responsible for certain things really don't understand why these types of initiatives are being pushed forward. Or sometimes they feel really unfairly targeted by policy that's actually just trying to create a better future for everyone. So I think these are kind of things which in the sort of nature-based urban infrastructure sector, then we're talking about folks like developers and building companies that sort of are the ones digging holes in the ground and building things. So actually they're really important stakeholders in this process. And if they're not engaged and not interested, then it can lead to lots of failures. And that's what I've been working with.
No, very, very interesting. And I guess to sum it up in its simplest form, if we had to put a tagline here, it's about who pays and who benefits.
I think so. I mean, this is the key question that I think is the critical one. If you have any stake in nature-based solutions, especially urban nature-based solutions, now we're talking about those kind of that are in the cities, who pays for those and who benefits? And that's an economic question. And that's why actually I've been really interested in the economics of this, because I don't think it's a term to frighten engineers off. Engineers are logical people. And at the end of the day, economics in this frame of understanding, the logic behind who does what, this is really important so that we can actually have functioning policies, functioning schemes, and just a functioning NBS industry. Yeah, so that's at least why I was drawn towards this. We've done some work here in kind of Sitra on this, even more broadly than just looking at urban infrastructure, but just nature conservation and sort of nature protection in general. And we have a report out called Carrots and Sticks.
A very, very interesting document. I had a lot of pleasure reading through it, and actually it really shed some light on, I guess, some frameworks that we hear of every now and then, but sort of makes it more concrete, especially for someone who is not as familiar with, with economics and with these kinds of systems that are available. But reason why it's so complex is because who pays and who benefits are not necessarily the same people.
No.
But I think there's generally a public good that results from it. But the question is, I guess, do we somehow need to loop that back? Is that equitable? Is the investment justifiable? And I guess when you start talking about public and private or public versus private, that's really the question, is it fair? Maybe that's the word that I'm looking for, being a non-economist here.
Absolutely. Yeah. If a system is unfair, I think you can expect it to not last very long.
Yeah.
I think we as a society and humans have sort of this general aversion to things that are obviously unfair.
Yeah.
But more so than that, I think it also just comes down to if you want change and you want your city to be green and you want things to be built in a certain way and you want certain benefits and ecosystem services to be considered, then you have to be able to have their sort of economic logic to back that up, because the current system is not structured in such a way that private sector or even public sector is incentivized to do new things and to sort of build urban greenery or nature-based solutions, water-sensitive urban design, whichever label we want to put on it. They don't want to do that, or they won't do that unless there's some push to do it. Yeah. So then designing the push, how do we do that?
Economics 101. It's all about incentives in the end, or disincentives.
It's all about incentives. Yeah. So, for instance, our report explored some case studies of different examples of, for instance, the polluter pays mechanism. So those folks that are causing the environmental damage might be the ones to then subsidise how to fix it.
Yep.
And then also we looked at sort of payments for ecosystem services. So then the beneficiaries of the benefits which sort of stem from this type of nature-based solutions, those would be the ones that somehow are schemed up to actually pay for it through some sort of crediting system, through some sort of incentive scheme. So this was what we looked at. And of course, there's not that many good examples because these things are difficult. So we kind of collected a few, and there's a few good examples, but I think there's almost more bad examples than good. And it goes to show that this is a really tricky question. Yeah. Tricky but necessary, I would say.
Well, I guess it's a reality we have to face, in our current economic system, unless we overhaul the system completely. But that in itself, I think, is a lot harder than trying to integrate this and find the way that works. Yeah. And you talk about really the polluter pays. That's actually one I've heard since high school, actually, because that's been around for quite some time, since 1920s, I believe.
Yeah.
And that's really the disincentive system. You pollute, you have to then bear the cost. And this often can be done either directly because, there is something that you can put a dollar value on, or through a compensation mechanism by paying some third party who's doing their part to actually improve, I guess, nature or the environment elsewhere. So that's one aspect or one side
Correct.
of the coin. And then the other one is really the payment for ecosystem services, which is more those who benefit can then provide the financial support. And voluntary systems and other solutions as well that sort of link to that. But that is also sometimes a bit difficult to do, I guess, because when we think of nature and ecosystem services, which is often very closely coupled to nature-based solutions, the benefits that nature can provide, whether it's flood protection, whether it's heat mitigation, habitat, cultural values, not all of that can really be quantified in terms of dollar value. I mean, yes, we have ways, such as in floods and heat, to sort of look at the avoided costs. So, insurance claims if there's a big flood, well, we've just avoided that and all the damage costs. Heat, so hospital call-outs, mortalities. I don't even want to go there and put a value on human life because I think that's a whole can of worms itself.
Yeah.
But then there's a lot of other benefits that we just don't understand how to put a price on at the moment. So how do we sort of navigate that in trying to create an incentive scheme rather than a disincentive scheme?
Yeah, I actually think that there's both needed. So I think, for instance, polluter pays and PES both have their place. I think if a government is functioning as it should, then it should be taxing those activities that are most harmful, even if those activities are necessary in society. I mean, emissions is the most obvious example and actually reasonably successfully implemented within the European Union of how to sort of reduce emissions through disincentives or the polluter pays mechanism. But yeah, the other version, how to get the beneficiaries to pay for what they receive. I mean, if we just take nature-based solutions in cities as an example, I mean, it's the general public, maybe the residents in the sort of neighborhood who tend to benefit. Of course, the sort of local flora and fauna are not going to be opening up their
bank accounts,
pocket books. So then how do you get then those folks that can pay? And I think actually one really important concept when you start to think about this from a practical level, if you're in local government and you're trying to think of some scheme, you also have to think of the ability to pay. Who actually can pay? Because it's not necessarily a question of who should pay. Maybe it's who kind of receives the benefits from these different types of infrastructure, but who actually has the means to pay.
Yeah, interesting.
We've spoken about in Melbourne as an example with the sort of nitrogen pricing, which is a good example of the polluter pays mechanism.
Yeah, that is a very interesting thing that's been around for quite some time.
Yeah.
I guess to sum it up, and it's also a bit related to how water-sensitive urban design has in a way been incentivized or disincentivized in catchments. So it has helped drive the adoption. I guess Melbourne Water, overseeing the management of water quality in the bays, also puts a price on this externality, which is the result of nitrogen ending up in the bay if it's not dealt with in the catchments. And we actually had a fun chat about this because apparently there's an exact number for the price, which is the total annual load of nitrogen should be reduced. Otherwise, you're paying something like 6,645 kilograms per nitrogen.
Yeah, 6,000 Australian dollars, I think you meant to say there.
Yeah.
I think you said kilograms. Per kilogram, I think is the...
You see, I'm already shying away from dollar numbers. It's showing itself. No, $6,500 per kilogram of nitrogen. Not 6,500 kilograms. Yes, that would be terrible.
Yeah, but I mean, this is really interesting case study. And actually, it's difficult to get these types of things politically through.
Yeah.
So I think congratulations to those folks that were instrumental in making this happen all those years ago. But what it has done is it's created a market for water-sensitive urban design. Now councils have some money to spend on this thing. Developers are the ones who pay this price, and they actually do have the ability to pay in the Australian market because the Australian property market is really friendly to developers. So this is when you're designing the scheme, if you're somewhere else, for instance, we've been thinking about in Finland, like how could such a scheme that incentivizes urban nature-based solutions, how could that be put together? It can't be a carbon copy of the Melbourne nitrogen case because the circumstances are very different.
That's true.
The Finnish property market is completely different. The value chain of how property is developed is completely different.
Is nitrogen a big issue in Finland?
Well, nutrients definitely are, but even the sort of the nutrient or the pollutant that you might choose as the proxy of sort of what you're measuring, it might not be nitrogen. At least here in the Baltic, phosphorus is also like a really important. So all of these considerations need to be thought through, and I think at least in Finland, there is some real momentum towards using nature-based solutions here in cities. But interestingly, it might not be the water that actually is the driving force or the water pollution. One thing that we've been looking at really closely here in Finland is actually the health benefits.
Yep.
And of course, in Australia, that is sort of tied very closely to heat mitigation. But here in Finland, not so much. There isn't that much heat.
I mean, that is true. You got more snow, so...
But for instance, we're talking things about mental health and being active and sort of these other implicit ways which having nature close to people in urban areas really actually reduces the burden on the public healthcare system. This is something that's really interesting for folks in Finland. And it just goes to show how you might, if you're a professional in this sector, how you might need to adapt yourself if you start to try and apply these concepts elsewhere.
Health benefits of nature have been well known for quite some time. Actually, for those who are interested, there is a book. We've also referred to it on episode 25 with Shabar Ali, but it's called The Nature Fix by Florence Williams. And it's not just Finland that that cares about nature for mental health. There's also the tradition in Japan, forest bathing, where people go into the forest to just recover and recuperate.
Exactly.
I mean, there is something about nature. I myself do that too. When I'm stressed or when I'm just overloaded, I take a walk along the creek and I feel rejuvenated. So, but how do you price that? How do you market that? How do you incentivize that? And related to that, all the other benefits, the biodiversity, having a laugh when a frog tries to cross the footpath in the middle of the park, so it, I think, also highlights the one recurring message that we always have on the show, which is there is no one-size-fits-all solution.
No.
While it may be nitrogen in Melbourne, it is mental and physical well-being in Finland. Yeah, for sure. I think trying to find the one-size-fits-all, and that statement, I think, carries also from the really high level, trying to answer the why question, kind of why are we doing this in the first place, but also to the what question. What kind of nature-based solutions are we talking about? I mean, can you build bioretention systems in the street in Finland? Well, you can, but you better think it through because there's a lot of different circumstances. And we were actually talking earlier, Peter, about this, some of the documents that are put out by these international organizations, which are framed as the handbook for nature-based solutions. And it's kind of a global document. And then you get into it and you kind of realize that many of the case studies or examples have been made for a very specific environment or context. And I think that's a little bit of I just think it gives false hope to folks that you can contain this thinking within a 70-page handbook that's then going to be useful across the globe. And there's these sort of international organizations like the World Bank that put these type of documents together. And I think they're well guided, but they kind of miss substance somehow. And I think that's something where I reckon each person working in their own little environment really can take this, let's say, conceptual understanding of nature-based solutions. And that's why I think it is really important to actually work on that concept. Because then it needs to be distilled into each location according to the circumstances or context. That is true. Well, what is the right answer here? I think I agree with you in the sense that, we have these handbooks. They should by no means be treated as, the blanket solution to everything. But I think without these handbooks, we wouldn't have that, I guess, initial push, giving people that initial, knowledge base from which they have to go and then figure out how it works in their particular location. What I think maybe we don't do enough is then the localization of that knowledge. And that's something that, I guess, as traditional engineering, educated people, we sort of see where that came from. Standards help ensure safety and serviceability of any assets we design. But at the same time, with the world changing so dynamically as it is, exactly that local scale solution is now at the forefront. And that's something I think we just need to do a lot more of. And maybe that's where guidance documents on how to then localize the knowledge are needed.
Yeah, because I think that there's so much that we can learn from each other. I think really, like I was saying, experiences in Melbourne can influence these kind of cities and organizations elsewhere. Of course, it's not a copy and paste exercise and it shouldn't be treated as so. But I think when you get down to technicals and kind of what you're putting in the ground, you really have to think about your own environment and make sure that you're not sort of bringing assumptions from elsewhere. But yeah, I kind of resonate with what you say. It's important that we have these kind of larger organizations pushing forward the concept.
Yeah.
It's just that sometimes I think the case studies which they present can be a little bit narrow rather than broad.
Okay, I can see where you're coming from. And I guess that's where sharing the experience on platforms such as podcasts or presentations and seminars are quite valuable. So that's definitely something, I think we need to do a lot more of in terms of making that accessible.
Yeah.
Which brings me back to Finland. So what's the situation in Finland as far as nature-based solutions are concerned, and what are some of the unique aspects of them?
Finland's a really interesting country in the sense that it has nature quite close by to many people's lives. So the Finns are very outdoorsy people, just on a general level.
Mm-hmm.
I would say they also have a real connection, I think, to their country and their type of environment. So Finland is famous for its forests and for its lakes.
Yeah.
And these have a special place in people's lives, and many people have sort of close interactions with these nature typologies, even more so than some folks, for instance, that I know growing up in the suburbs of Melbourne, right?
Okay.
So that's something that's kind of nice. And I think that's something that's like a strength to be leveraged here. I think there's challenges that exist. The climate is not easy. So I think, for instance, dealing with cold climate within urban nature-based solutions, it's not impossible, but it just brings challenges that might not maybe exist elsewhere. And then also just, I think, the challenging people's adoption of like new ideas. And this is not a Finland specific issue. I think this is an issue everywhere, but just our local administrations and organizations are built to be efficient, but not innovative.
Yeah.
And then, so when you're really efficient, or maybe really efficient is a bit of a stretch, but at least striving towards efficiency, then you tend to sort of be adverse to innovation. And I think when new concepts like nature-based solutions come through, then there's a challenge, of course, in getting that adopted. But that's something that Sitra is really interested in, and sort of trying to scale up these new ideas in Finnish society. What else could I say? I think the health side is something that people are like really tuned into, as we discussed. And I think Finland really sort of like thinks about its nature as kind of an asset. So I think in that sense, people understand that there's value. Of course, it might not have some sort of monetary value attached to that, but people understand generally the value of being able to sort of get out into nature. So yeah, I mean, I'm a fan of this country, but I think, of course, they can also improve. And I would like to see, for instance, some more respect to some of the trees in Finnish cities that I sometimes think are kind of removed with a little bit too low a threshold. Because, for instance, there are so many forests that I think then the trees maybe in the cities lose their value. Whereas if we compare to Melbourne, where if you're in the inner city of Melbourne, you have to drive 2-3 hours before you hit a forest. So then maybe those trees that exist in the center of the city are more obviously need to be protected. So that's just a bit of a thought tangent from me.
Hey, but in economic terms, it's the scarcity mindset,
Exactly.
So, yeah.
Exactly.
I guess one other side of nature-based solutions, which is, also mentioned every now and then, sometimes maybe even used as the counter-argument, is the impact it can have on, I guess, the economic value of a neighborhood, which for those owning property there is great, because house prices can go up, and many studies have shown that property prices usually increase with the implementation of nature. But then that can also lead to green gentrification eventually, which then sort of, I guess, affects those who can't afford it in the future. And that is also dynamic to think about. But have you encountered questions like that in the work that you've been doing around nature-based solutions?
Maybe not so specific as green gentrification, but I think the general themes are there. So how to be equitable with this, how to make sure, I think in Finland, as there is in Australia, there's a massive difference between urban business centres and then smaller regional towns. And for instance, how to bridge that gap so that there's these types of things are accessible for both. That is a massive question. I don't think it's been measured too precisely in the Finnish context, maybe even the Nordic context. I'm not sure. This kind of idea of increased property prices, I think it's sort of implicitly understood, but I'm not sure whether there's been sort of extensive studies on that point. I think we need to be careful, but I think at the same time we need to understand that we're still improving the value of our cities. Then I don't think there's many cities in the world that are only planning nature-based solutions in like the richest areas. Yeah. We have a lot of issues and we have a lot of challenges to overcome. This one for me doesn't rank in the sort of top priority, at least yet. But I do think it's something we need to be aware of, because we don't want to slip into that slippery slope of then, increasing inequality in our cities.
I mean, it's the unintended consequence. And if we're not aware of it, it comes back to bite us. But as you said, I think we try to be strategic. And I think many cities are trying to be strategic as to where they place nature-based solutions in the cities. And we see lots of work going into mapping and understanding what the best suitability spots are. And we've had a few discussions of that on the show as well in previous episodes. We have to put a lot of these links in the show notes. But ultimately, I guess, that should not hold us back from pushing to have nature and restore nature in the cities.
No.
But as you said, in the back of our heads, knowing that that could be an issue, I think it always means we're prepared to face these potential consequences or avoid them in the first place, should the matter then arise.
Yeah. One little side note that I can just say here that even, Peter, I think you'd probably be pretty interested in is I think Finland is maybe one of the best countries I've ever been in or worked in terms of the quality of their spatial data.
Oh, okay.
So the spatial data that's available, both Finland-wide, but also especially, for instance, where I live in Helsinki, the resolution and the quality of the data is staggering.
Wow. Okay.
Actually, I did work with this when I was at Ramboll when we were trying to sort of work on the prioritization of sort of nature-based solutions here in Finland. And there's some also great work that's going on with some folks at the University of Helsinki on this. But having that is a bit of a game changer for researchers and for consultants because it just lets you experiment and play around. So that's actually one big plus mark that I'd say for folks working on this area is that the quality of data and also access to data is really, really good. So that's something where I think others could also learn from how the Finns do it.
I think, a quote that is very suitable and sort of encapsulates the discussion we've had so far is whatever gets measured gets managed.
Yeah.
And the data is just as much front and center because without the data, how are you going to understand what dollar values to put in the first place?
For example, I can just give an example for those kind of stormwater geeks that are in the audience. The imperviousness map of Helsinki is like frightening how accurate that it is.
Wow.
You can imagine what you can do with that as a stormwater engineer. So yeah, really, I mean, it's fun to play around with that one for sure.
No, that's amazing. I got to check that out. We have to have a separate conversation on this after the show because I'm definitely interested when it comes to data. So what does it mean to have a best practice sustainability strategy in 2025? We have also a dynamic landscape of new laws sweeping across Europe and also other parts of the world as well. But I guess given that we are in Europe, I think it's worth mentioning a few of these.
Yeah.
But I guess, taking it from the top, what is best practice sustainability?
Massive question, Peter. I'm now going to shift tack a little bit because we've been talking about cities a lot. I think this question is actually really interesting to tackle from like either just a private company or even like a financial player's perspective. And I'm talking about a company that might manufacture something or sort of do something there. In my opinion, if you're not talking about nature at the top of your sustainability strategy, you've kind of missed the bus in 2015, I would say. Climate change has been a massive driver of work in the environmental space, as it should have been, as one of our most urgent crises. But now this more holistic thinking of nature, of which climate change is kind of one driver of biodiversity loss, being a measure of sort of nature's vibrancy. This is kind of the pyramid, the way that I see it. And this is how companies can make sense of the fact that they have various ways which they impact nature, but they should prioritize those to then find the ones which are the most important to actually work on, because they can't maybe manage everything all at once.
And I don't think they expect it to do everything all at once, but I think it's a step in the right direction, I guess. Actually, a quote that I find very powerful in that regard is, without a healthy and functioning natural environment, we cannot sustain a healthy and functioning economy. And it pretty much sums up what you just explained, and also some of the key topics and processes we've sort of drawn upon over the course of the discussion.
Yeah, I think I completely agree. And I guess that kind of comes at it from this kind of strategic perspective, the why question. Why are we doing this?
Yep.
Of course, we can try to reduce our environmental impact. If I'm the sort of leader of a company, I can try to reduce our environmental impact because I think that's a good thing to do. But it might not reflect into my business success in the short term. However, if you start to understand the dependencies that companies and different industries have on nature and the ecosystem services that it provides, then you can start to actually draw some business logic into the decision making. Why, as an agriculture or like a food processing company, why should we try to sort of mitigate some of these drivers of biodiversity loss? Well, because our entire value chain depends on it. This type of thinking, I think, is what should really encapsulate best practice in 2015. Oh my goodness, 2025. And I hope and I'm glad to see more companies moving towards that direction recently.
And I think that's also been partly driven by a push of new legislation as well. I guess one big one being the EU Nature Restoration Law, which I think just got passed last year. The years are sort of melting into each other. I'm losing track of time. This is terrible.
And I guess the EU is such a big behemoth for those people that aren't familiar with it. It can be also really confusing because I guess there's the moment that it gets accepted by the Parliament, but then there's a different moment where it sort of becomes implemented by the Commission, which is kind of like the bureaucratic arm of the EU. So I don't think it's quite as clear cut as sort of one start date, unfortunately.
But they like to set targets. And I think this is probably the more important bit to sum up what that law really is. And it's about the EU member states having to restore at least 30% of habitats that are in poor condition by 2030. And then it just goes up the ladder. So 60% hopefully by 2040 and 90% by 2050. So really putting nature at the forefront, saying this is a priority now. And I guess, given that is law, we have to now use that and find the incentives, within these constraints. And they are incentives. I think we've highlighted that. There are ways to create that value and that new kind of value that we are maybe not familiar with.
Yeah, for sure. The nature restoration law is really important because it sets kind of the North Star for the member states of the EU in terms of what they should be doing. There's so many different ways to sort of dig into this topic. But I think one thing that I'd like to just flag is that it's also not all smooth sailing in Brussels at the moment. There's a massive agenda at the moment with the global environment, Trump, Putin, China, all of these massive kind of geopolitical tensions that are forcing Brussels to sort of divert attention away from things like the nature restoration law towards how can we survive in a sort of ultra competitive dog-eat-dog world. And these are some of the tensions that the politicians are grappling with, and they have flow-on effects. One of the other big pieces of legislation that sustainability professionals are familiar with in Europe is the CSRD and the CSDDD. So these big acronyms, but effectively a reporting requirement for companies to really transparently report their progress and their impact on all kinds of sustainability matters, and then a due diligence requirement so that they should check their value chain so that horrible things are not happening to people or the environment within their own value chains, even from outside of Europe.
So corporate sustainability laws that, I guess, put that extra effort on companies.
Yeah, and this is how the government starts to pull the levers towards forcing companies to do things because they sort of tighten the screws on what you have to publicly disclose and sort of what procedures you have to do to check that there's no damage. But unfortunately, these have just had the clock stopped in Brussels on these ones, at least for 12 months, because the EU is concerned, amongst other reasons, that there's some impact on European business competitiveness on these sort of extra regulations. So there's good things, there's bad things, and I guess that's how we go. It's not sort of a straight line in terms of our progress. But I think Europe is a really nice place to work on some of these topics because the EU is a real leader in terms of how it can set and put nature or sort of recognize the importance of nature in the economy, but also people's well-being into the future. And I think
definitely
kind of like the well-being being really key there, that the EU seems to prioritize that in at least some of its decision-making. So,
hey, I mean, if Melbourne doesn't keep winning the most livable city awards, I think Adelaide did it as well. But if it's neither of them, then it's usually a city in Europe, be it Vienna or be it, I think Zurich won it at some point. Yeah. So, I take that credit. No. So, yeah, I guess well-being very much at the center of people's minds in Europe as well. But not only those kinds of I guess call it incentives now through regulation, but also circular economy thinking. So this idea of resource recovery, which has also swept across a lot of wastewater treatment plants, even to rebrand them as resource recovery facilities, to see how we can then, reuse a lot of these, I guess, waste products, or not look at them as waste products, because there is a value chain there associated with them.
circular economy, I think, deserves its own. I mean, I'm sure there is a whole wealth of circular economy podcasts out there too.
Oh, most
but
likely.
I think the nature-based solutions on one hand and circular economy on our other hand, these are our two best toolboxes of how we can actually start to address some of the sort of systemic environmental issues that we have. And just to touch on circular economy for a moment, it effectively means that you kind of end this kind of linear create, use and waste or like dispose sort of product chain that we actually use in almost 90% of our different types of industries. I think for folks that have worked in water, it's really obvious because you've studied the water cycle.
You know, yeah, that's true. And
So
for those
it's
especially who have lived in Melbourne, it's even more obvious.
So I think if you're a water engineer, it's just applying the water cycle principles to the rest of the economy. So really trying to close the loop is the classic catchphrase that people use, but it really is that. The EU has a really exciting opportunity to do that because it has this amazing single market that lets people move across borders. It lets people and companies sell things across borders. And this concept of a circular single market is a really, really exciting concept and kind of at the core of some actually exciting new legislation and strategies coming out of the EU, which should be pushing, I think, circular economy as one of the main drivers there. And I'm really happy to say that actually Sitra has been involved in circular economy for, I think, 15 maybe close to 20 years.
Wow.
And it's been really pushing it as a topic and kind of trying to influence also Brussels to go in that direction in its environmental sort of strategy. So circular economy is something that we work with a lot here in Sitra.
Now that's, being the pioneers, that's close to the pioneers. Circular thinking has been around for quite some time, but really being at the forefront now and pushing that, that's amazing. And you do have a report on that too, which we'll definitely have to share in the show notes so that people can read up more about it. I like your reports. They're written in a very accessible way. And I think that's very important with knowledge and something also close to your heart, which I know we will get into. But prior to that, there is one more framework that I think has been quite important and also worth understanding as well, which is this TNFD and associated with that LEAP, so TNFD-LEAP as we call it. What is this TNFD-LEAP framework?
Yeah, so now we're pivoting towards the sort of financials industry, not exclusively so. But this is a group of people that are particularly interested in the TNFD. So what is the TNFD? It's a task force for nature-related financial disclosures. So effectively, what that means in everyday speak is instructions for how to write a report of how your business is affected by nature. The idea being is that once businesses and investors especially understand the risks that different companies are exposed to in the current climate change scenario that we're on or biodiversity loss sort of environment that we have, that they'll start to react and move the money accordingly. Or engage then with those companies to make them do something about it. So this is why I'm interested in it, because I think it's a really interesting leverage point to sort of make impact happen. Effectively, what is it? So it kind of brings you through a 4-step process that helps you locate, evaluate, assess, and then prepare all of the different kind of risks and opportunities that you might be exposed to as a business related to nature.
That's what the LEAP stands for.
Yes, LEAP.
Yeah. And in a way, you can call it looking at it from a risk perspective. So, the links, how does my company associate with nature, leverage or benefit from it? And then if something goes wrong, what are the potential areas that can go wrong? And then it serves as a roadmap for them to then manage their business in a profitable but still sustainable and also safe and secure way into the future.
Yeah. I mean, if it's used in its most sort of ambitious format, it can form a roadmap, but it can also just form an exercise of sort of just understanding what I'm exposed to.
Which is sometimes enough for companies.
Yeah. And I mean, well, it can be a first step. And so we've been working on this specifically within the financial sector and different types of investment organizations to really understand, okay, if they have their money spread across all of these different companies and areas and geographies, what does that really mean and how do I have impact and risk exposure because of biodiversity loss or sort of different impacts to nature? So really exciting work. It's kind of coming at it from maybe the opposite end, that if people are kind of working with on the ground nature-based solutions, which is kind of the end of the kind of nature-based value chain, if you will.
Yeah.
This is right at the top and trying to get money then directed towards those kind of companies that are innovative and doing the right things, or those type of companies companies that are actually trying to transform and maybe away from the laggards that are trying to just put their fingers in their ears and just go la, 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 la.
Yeah. Financial models, which, we have lacked in the past, but I think are finding ways to progress towards them. Also, there's a certain branding that relates to that too, because, it looks good as well on paper every now and then when, a company then adopts this or has done this exercise. And I guess it's not just plain greenwashing, because it does require a very in-depth assessment.
Yeah, I mean, branding is one of the main reasons that companies have been interested in sustainability for the past 35 years, and that's not going to change.
Yeah.
I guess the main thing is to actually make sure that there's some substance behind kind of what they're doing. And that's the purpose of these frameworks, is to try to standardize the approach so that it doesn't become every person for themselves trying to figure out how to do this, which of course inevitably ends up in the absolute wild west of approaches. So this is hopefully a standardization towards how we can start to be, procedural and scientific about this kind of sustainability work.
Let's see what the future holds, but I think definitely a step in the right direction. At least I can see from a scientist's perspective, that scientific rigor of it, the systematic approach of it is definitely very appealing. So what you're currently working on, what are your lines of thinking currently and going forward?
Yeah, well, look, we've touched on many of them. One thing that is really in the forefront of my mind now is getting these best practice sort of corporate environmental and sustainability strategies. So really helping companies to make sure that they're spending their effort on the things which are going to be most impactful for not just them, but also then the rest of society and the environment. I think this is key because there's been so much development in this area. Companies kind of just started to understand climate change, and then suddenly, boom, this new topic of nature was dumped on them. And nature is about like an order of magnitude more complex than just climate. So you can imagine then just a kind of knowledge burden, I think is kind of a good word, of these organizations that are not environmental organizations. They're not research organizations. They're not used to adopting new and sort of innovative sustainability approaches. Yeah. So just facilitating that, I think, is like a really useful and somehow impactful topic to be working on. In the same breath, I think then just making it easier for money to flow towards those things that are positive to the kind of future that we're talking about, that would include nature-based solutions and circular economy, and trying to get rid of these barriers that exist, sometimes artificial barriers that are just there because nobody has taken them away.
That's true.
So these are maybe some of the topics that I'm really thinking about.
I guess one particular aspect which we didn't really touch upon as much. I mean, we talked about the who pays and who benefits, but I guess one aspect is this idea of investment and addressing this idea of investing in nature. I think that's been at the forefront of your mind in recent work, as well as Sitra's mind as well.
Yeah, for sure. I think how to invest in nature, and I mean that can mean different things for different stakeholders. I mean, if you're a company, you might invest in nature by hiring people that know about nature. If you're an investor, you might try to invest in companies that have a solution or that, are part of the green transition. And then, of course, there's the whole discussion about sort of credits and sort of compensation and sort of investment elements of that, how to get money flowing into compensation, maybe through some sort of nature credits. All of these are very relevant. And I think, for instance, when you say nature investment, people immediately start thinking about the credits. But I think it's a trap, because I think the other ways which you can invest in nature kind of higher up the value chain, but just as important and maybe even more impactful. Yeah, we've been looking at credits. Finland has a really interesting and quite innovative, actually, biodiversity compensation scheme that's up and running. It's only really recent, and I'm not the right person to go into the details about that, but there's lots of work going on to try and figure out how to make these type of schemes attractive, but also robust. And attractive and robust are not always concepts that easily meld together.
I believe the example of Finland, it's the Forest Biodiversity Program in southern Finland.
There's a few, yeah. That is one example. Actually, the example I'm talking about, Peter, wasn't in the Carrots and Sticks report because it wasn't yet established. It's so new.
Okay.
But yeah, it's trying to establish a system where companies and developers can compensate by buying sort of compensation credits for their activities. So, yeah.
Credits aside, but also different systems aside, one very important aspect which has also shaped your career and where you're heading is this idea of communication around sustainability. And you've actually started your own coaching agency. Congratulations on taking that step.
Thank you.
Into really teaching people how to communicate better Tell me a bit about that, the idea behind it and what your mission is with this new agency.
Yeah, for sure. So the sort of agency is called First Arrow. The idea behind it is that your first arrow should be the one, if you're going to shoot it, it needs to be a good one.
It has to hit the target right in the bullseye.
Exactly. So, I mean, the whole purpose is just to give people the tools to be able to really explain what's in their mind and to do that sort of broadly across a professional's kind of different types of interactions and career. So we do coaching where we try to help people at least understand what skills they have and then how to communicate them. But I think really relevant for this discussion is that we often work with engineers who have brilliant brains.
No doubt.
But sort of translating that into then how they communicate with either their clients or their colleagues or their bosses or whatever to get those ideas out of their brain in such a way that other people can kind of coalesce around it. That takes a different skill set oftentimes than it does to actually come up with a fantastic design. And I think that there's a big blind spot. This is a bit of a tangent, but it's perhaps the reason that I started the company is that I think there's a massive blind spot in engineering education because we spend all of our time doing maths and we don't spend that much time at all thinking about how to communicate maths or ideas. So this is what First Arrow does is, I mean, we provide coaching and training for folks with presentation skills, with negotiations, even sales, these types of things which maybe sound like foreign and horrible concepts, but actually when you start working in the industry, you realize they're terribly, terribly necessary.
But definitely a very important skill because, if we don't communicate properly, then often the message gets lost in translation sometimes, perhaps as well.
Yeah, for sure. I think this point is even more relevant when you think about working in a culture that's not your sort of native culture.
Yeah.
Because then you have not only your own, like the wires which you have to kind of navigate between your own mind and then your mouth in terms of what you say, but then also the wires between the other person's ears and their brain.
Yeah, that is true. And, when you have to then switch language, that's difficult enough.
Yes.
I guess you are now fluent in Finnish.
No, I'm not fluent in Finnish. I can understand Finnish.
Yeah.
I can read and write emails. But pretending that I can speak Finnish would be a lie.
I hear it's one of the most difficult languages to learn.
It is very difficult. Not impossible.
Okay.
And I'm often inspired by others that have moved to Finland and have maybe even been here for a bit less time than I have and have picked up the language. I've also been learning Swedish as my wife is also Swedish speaking. And that one is a Germanic language, Peter, much easier.
Is it Germanic? Okay.
Yeah. So we have a lot of similar grammar and vocabulary if you're an English speaker. So I probably put about the same emphasis into both. And I can confidently say that my Swedish is miles ahead of my Finnish. But both are still progressing.
The only Swedish I know is thank you and whatever I read in the IKEA catalogs. So.
Hey, that's already a fair bit.
That's a fair bit. Actually, I do remember seeing a YouTube video of someone attempting to navigate Sweden just using words from the IKEA catalog. But when I've then realized that it was in Swedish, I was like, oh, I can actually start to see words and sort of make out some relations to German, which I am fluent in.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think that there's that connection. It's interesting because Finnish is from a whole nother language family, even though they're kind of geographically close.
Yeah.
And that's what I think makes it a bit tricky.
Fascinating as well to see how the languages sort of work geographically.
Yeah.
Jarrod, it's been fascinating as well talking to you about a lot of things that I just tend to, get worried about or shy away from or get scared by, the economics of it. But you've shed a lot of light on it and I've really enjoyed this conversation so far. And like I do with every guest, I'd love to get into some more in-depth questions so that listeners can learn even more about you. And I guess one word that's been sort of hovering around this entire discussion has been innovation. We have to innovate in every kinds of aspect, in every system. So in your view, what does the word innovation truly mean and how has it shaped the way you approach challenges and opportunities in your work?
Yeah, fantastic question. Look, I think for me, innovation is really about your curiosity and sort of maintaining curiosity, which I think then if you go one level deeper, it's like your ability to accept that you don't know the best way. And I think that can be difficult, as we also get a bit older. I think we definitely have curiosity as like when we're kids and when we go through university. Those I think that are good students are generally curious because they're trying to understand the reason behind the questions which they're being grappling with. But I think it's a dangerous trap, actually, that when we start to get into professional life, we are now professionals. We're now the experts, right? We know how things should be. Well, do we actually? And I think that's the secret ingredient, I would say, to innovation is maintaining the curiosity on a personal level, of course, but also within a organization. If you can sort of keep people from thinking that they know how everything should be at this precise moment in time, I think then you have a breeding ground for some innovative ideas. So
I once heard a tip for testing your own understanding, and that was to adopt the child's mindset and ask why 5 times.
yes,
Also helps in deciding if you want to do something. You ask why 5 times. And if you can answer it,
I think that's a very good tip.
then then you can go for it.
Yeah.
Now, very, very important, I think, that curiosity, because we have to maintain that, because it also breeds creativity, and often the solutions then result from that.
Yeah.
And I think in a world where AI is now really becoming mainstream, creativity is something, or imagination even as a word, that I've used in a recent quote on the mini-series. Listeners, if you haven't checked it out, go have a look at it. Very fun mini-series. Creativity, imagination, that's something that I think really defines us as human, and we need to maintain going forward.
Yeah, for sure. Super important. And I think especially for folks that work in engineering, maybe more kind of procedural jobs. Yep. So I think that's where you can really start to become someone that your peers kind of look up to, is if you can sort of show creativity and stay curious to new ways of doing things. I think that's how I want to be when I also increase my age into the future. And also I realize that my brain starts to become more kind of rigid. I just want to remember to kind of stay curious.
I think that's a fear in everyone, that we lose our creativity with time, because we also transition from more technical kind of positions into more managerial roles, seeing the big picture, and I think that's where it's even more important to have the curiosity and the creativity.
Yeah.
Was there a key moment, book, person, or event that completely changed the course of your career or your mindset?
Actually, yes. I could say this one is quite easy for me to answer. Donut Economics. By Kate Raworth. I would recommend everybody read it. I think now that I've worked with this for some time, I can't agree with everything that's written in that book, but I think that book is such an eye-opener in terms of how you start to think about the big picture problems which we have, which is growth on a finite planet, right? So I think it's a brilliant book, brilliant concept, and maybe the thing I like the most about it, we haven't actually discussed this yet, Peter, but I'm a massive diagram guy. If you send me a slab of text and I have to communicate that to someone, I will immediately turn it into a diagram. And I think what Kate did with the whole concept of donut economics is just made it instantly graspable by a huge chunk of the population. So yeah, that one's my favorite book, I think, that's changed the course of my career, and I think has really influenced me in terms of what I'm now thinking about and grappling with.
And donut economics, and also the funny realization that, hit me and, listeners, I'm also listening to this for the first time. I have no idea what Jarrod's responses are to these questions. So I clearly could not have planted it, but there seems to always be recurring themes that seem to hit at the same time between podcast episode releases. So definitely do check out episode 42 with Marshall Yastani, because we went into an in-depth discussion of donut economics, which really is a different way of thinking about, I guess, society, about how we look at resource use and, I guess, sustainability as well.
Yeah.
This idea of staying within planetary boundaries, being able to not overextend our stay, but then also catering to society's needs. And so the donut itself being the safe operating space. Did I encapsulate it well enough?
I think you nailed it. And like I said, I don't think it's like the perfect mantra that sort of fixes everything. I think, of course, it's like any good model. It's got simplifications and assumptions built into there. But what I actually really like is how it grasps the problem, how it kind of frames the planetary boundaries and the fact that we need to grapple with those boundaries. And I think that's what flicked a switch in my mind when I read that book.
So now I have a confession to make. So I did say after episode 42 that I would go and order the book. It's sitting in my cart. I just have to order it. Yeah, I'm also channeling sustainable consumption, leave it in your cart for 24 hours. It's been more than that, but still. So I'm going to have to definitely get the book now, because this is, pure chance that it comes up right now, just 2 episodes away from each other. But
if you come to Helsinki soon, you can borrow my copy. But let's see if we can make that happen.
Yeah, my to-travel list is growing. I know my friends in London definitely want me there, and I'm overdue for Australia, and Scandinavia is definitely on the list. So we'll have to organize something. Definitely. What tips and strategies can you offer in terms of time management? How do you maintain a balance between your professional and personal time?
This is a really important question, I think, for people. And I don't know if I'm the one who sort of has all the answers here, but at least what I do is I try to set realistic goals for myself. I think if I can do one really important thing per day, then that day is successful. not try to have 10 meetings that are all as important as each other. Yes, maybe you might have 10 meetings on your schedule, but one of them is the most important. Figure out what that is and then kind of dedicate yourself to being successful in that one. I think for me, that just helps to kind of clarify my mind and really set a bit of a structure to each day. Okay, today I might have to do 10 things, but actually the most important thing is this thing. And that's kind of the purpose of today. And I try to do that also a little bit in personal life. So I think having one professional kind of like, don't have a to-do list, have a to-do.
Yeah.
And just to have today's most important thing to do and do it and then cross it off. And then do the same thing for your personal life. So don't frame your entire day around work. Have some sort of personal life to do as well and try to make that happen. And I always say when I'm coaching and talking to sort of younger folks, always remember that work will be there when you get back. There are very, very few circumstances that like cannot wait. Remember, like your personal life often cannot wait. You know, you have many obligations that cannot wait in your personal life, especially if you have kids or if you have a partner. Those things cannot wait. Work usually can wait.
Yeah.
So that would be my my 2 tips.
I've heard a business speak version of that before, and that is to create your minimum viable day.
Yeah.
I guess
It's the same thing.
Yeah, same thing. Or eating the frog if it's the most important thing, but not always the nicest.
Yeah.
Whether you like it or not.
Yep.
And I do agree. To-do lists are not exactly the best.
It lets you procrastinate.
It does. I've tried something different, which is I've tried to treat it as a to-do shopping list. So I get to do whatever I want, or a menu, call it that, not a shopping list, a menu. But yeah, I mean, I think having that one item that you can cross off, I think the satisfaction of crossing that off is probably what really, triggers the psychological euphoria in you. So very, very good tip. What is your favorite childhood memory?
Yeah, favorite childhood memory. I think it's spending time. Actually, I'm going to loop this right back to the start. We spoke about Australian football right at the start of the episode. I'm a big sporting fan and I'm sort of always trying to be active with sports. And I think that's been because I was taken to a lot of sports and played heaps of sports as a kid. I think my favorite memory is sort of attending football matches with my dad and my brothers and kind of having that flow state of being sort of just into the game for 2 hours or whatever it is with your family. I can just vividly remember the whole experience, walking there from the train station, buying the tickets, like getting the seats. Yeah, it's special. So I think that's something that's tattooed in my brain and probably will stay there forever.
That's lovely to hear. And the family time, invaluable. I always reminisce as well of a lot of these times in my childhood with family.
Yeah.
Very lovely. And so what was one of the most challenging situations that you've ever faced in your career to date? And how did you overcome it?
Yeah. This was, I think, just learning to deal with the responsibility that comes when you start to progress in your career. Responsibility is something that most people sort of aspire to, like to kind of have some more like responsibility within your work, whatever that is. But that also has a negative effect that when something goes wrong, I mean, you're on the hook.
Yeah, that's true.
So I think my first experience with that was something that I really had to grapple with and learn to deal with the stress that comes from that. I'm a bit of a perfectionist and I kind of keep myself to a really high standard with my work. And so then when something goes wrong and it's kind of on you, then that's difficult to reconcile, actually. The way that I got through it is something that I recommend to everyone. And that was actually a discussion with my then mentor. I actually called him and I said, look, we're only meant to be meeting in, I think, 2 weeks. Can we meet tomorrow? And he said, yeah. And we discussed. And I mean, it was just the ability to kind of vent about work stuff to someone who's in a third party is just so underrated in the professional world. So I think that if you don't have a mentor, really consider it or consider becoming a mentor for somebody else or both. Because I think in those crunch times, when you find something or some kind of challenging situation hits, that's when it's valuable. But it's too late at that point. Yeah. So then you should think about it before.
I guess being prepared ahead of time and having someone with that wisdom, with an outside perspective, especially who I guess understands sort of the business or how it works, I think is incredibly invaluable.
Yeah, and I think it doesn't even necessarily have to be someone who is like in that industry. I think it should be someone who doesn't have a personal connection to you, because that kind of provides some bias and shouldn't be from the same company or organization, because then they can look at things really objectively and say, hey, Jarrod, what are you worrying about? This is normal operation. Just like try to relax. Or they can say, hey, this is a really messed up kind of situation and you should think about doing something. So I think having that clarity that comes with being from the outside is just so valuable when you get caught up in some difficult situation and you can't see the forest for the trees.
Yeah, sage advice, very interesting way of looking at it, but I think very important as well. It makes total sense having that mentor. Yeah, and what other advice can you offer to young professionals starting out, particularly going into sustainability as well?
Yeah, learn to deal with trade-offs. Unfortunately, we can't fix the world in a straight line. It's a very wiggly line. So then I would just say be comfortable with trade-offs and be comfortable with non-linear progress, because that's the reality of working in most industries, but I would say especially sustainability. There's ups and there's downs. There's time periods where it's politically not popular. There's time periods where it's the buzzword. And just learning to manage yourself on that roller coaster so that you don't kind of get pulled along with the tide too much, that you can kind of, you've thought about why you want to work here. It's deeper than any surface level trend that can change from year to year, and that you can understand kind of your motivations beyond that of what somebody else tells you. So I think that's what I would say.
No, that's lovely. And I think it really highlights the reality. And we shouldn't have to feel dread or be directly affected by these external forces, but to remind ourselves what our internal vision and mission is and to stick with it. I guess the grit is very important.
Yeah, and I think if you look at anyone successful, it wasn't obvious that they were going to be successful when they started out. So they started out for a different reason. And they started out because they cared about whatever they were doing, and they sort of stuck it out through the hard times. So that's what I would say. And especially I think that's just maybe advice based on where we are at the moment. It's a difficult time with everything that's going on in the world, and sustainability might fall down the agenda from where it has been. But it's such a long-term game that we're playing here that for folks that are only starting out their career, it might seem like the end of the world, but it's not. Yeah. It's not. And it's a worthwhile effort to sort of spend your career on.
Play the long game.
That's it.
Definitely. And so what would you most like to be remembered for?
Goodness me. This is maybe the most difficult question of the whole lot, I would say. What would I most like to be remembered for? I think I would hope that I don't want to be famous. I don't want like everyone to sort of remember who I am. I don't think that is something which is important to me, but I want those people that know me to think that like I had my values and were in the right place, and that I always treated everyone well. I actually pride myself on that professionally. It's a bit of the work we do with kind of First Arrow too, is to really make sure that you leave a genuine impression on everyone. Doesn't mean that you have to agree with everyone or sort of say yes to everyone, but everyone that you deal with professionally and also in personal life knows that you're being honest and, you know, that you have integrity, you know, these types of core things. I think that's, if you think about your legacy, that's really what I would hope for. Of course, I would love to be the person that solves the global environmental crisis, but that's not really what drives me, I would say. And I also don't think that's how you become famous in 2025.
Yeah. Oh boy, we can have a long discussion about that too. And what's actually, you know, truly famous and not. I guess there's different nuances to that word as well. But yeah, no, definitely noble cause, but also, you know, I guess important, a good reflection. And I'm very proud of that question because it has stumped quite a few guests.
Yeah.
I've only just started using it. So
it's a good one.
I think it's a very important one. We need to think more existentially as well, because that helps us redefine and reinforce our own values.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so where can people find you if they want to get in touch?
Yeah, well, I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, so I'd encourage people to reach out there. I usually post a bit of what I'm working on, and then I try to engage with interesting things that I see. So send me a message on LinkedIn if you want to talk about any of these topics more.
And we'll definitely include that link in the show notes, along with a lot of insightful reports and documents and links, as well as the Footy rules that we mentioned.
Yes,
we promised
most
that.
Important.
Yep. And I guess we'll link your favorite team. Maybe we'll link the team I supported as well, which is Hawthorn back in the day.
Okay.
But Jarrod, it's been lovely reconnecting at such a deep level after so long. We've spoken every now and then through a message exchange, but to really sit together and have this chat, it's been an absolute pleasure. And so thank you very much for coming onto the show.
Yeah, it's been brilliant. Thanks for inviting me. And I really appreciate this hour and a half that we've spent together. It's been fantastic.
And like I do with every guest, I always give my guest the final words. So one last message for the listeners to take away from today.
I would say play the long game. on sustainability, if you play the short game, you're going to fail. You have to play the long game. Don't get caught up in the short term.
Thank you very much. And that wraps up our deep, insightful and fascinating episode with Jarrod Luxton. For more information on the rules of Australian footy, carrots, sticks, snow and daylight, or just a good rundown of different economic and sustainability literature, check out the show notes for more information over at peterandbach.com/podcast. And as always, thank you listeners for tuning into this episode and for your feedback and support. If you're enjoying this show, I would be incredibly grateful if you could share this podcast with your family, friends, colleagues, and even fellow economists. Subscribe or follow this podcast on Spotify, Apple Music, other podcast channels, or follow the LinkedIn group to stay up to date with the latest releases. If you're curious about me or my work in general, you can also check out my website or social media. Head to peterandbach.com, my YouTube channel, Peter Marcus Bach, that's Marcus with a C, or follow me on X at Peter and Bach or Instagram at peterandbach87. Feel free to reach out to me with any feedback or guest suggestions so that I can keep improving this show. The podcast intro and outro song is called Starsky by Alex Kieran. Stay tuned for our next episode and next guest to hear how they are tackling the grand challenges.